Bro, this is
So
massive because I still got a
we've,
bunch I needed to do.
I know, we've spent like endless time. Let's see if we're live. And it's funny too. We've put together matrices. I have a client that I'm doing probably 100 of these for. He's a private equity guy, and he's got, uh, pretty. Yeah, we're live. Okay. All right, cool. He's got a pretty extensive holding company of businesses, and he is um was needing to make, hundreds of these filings.
Wild.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is interesting. I think we had saw this coming, right? To some extent. There was a letter from, was it Janet Yellen?
I don't recall
I have it
if that's
right
true.
here. I have it saved in my phone because I'm a dork. Yes, here it is right here. This was the Honorable Janet Yellen, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury on November 5th. So
Yeah.
less than a month ago. We are writing regarding the beneficial ownership information reporting requirements implemented by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, under the Corporate Transparency Act. Specifically, we're concerned about both the complex nature and lack of awareness of these new obligations. And so what she was saying is, although filing under the CTA, Corporate Transparency Act, began at the beginning of the year, FinCEN reports it had received were just 10% of the required submissions, which is scary. What she
Yeah,
was
that's wild.
saying, yeah, she said failure to comply can result in fines of over $590 per day, as well as felony charges and up to 2 years imprisonment. Um, and they had less than 10% compliance.
Yeah, because like how would anyone have known unless you're talking to your lawyer about it or your accountant about it? Half the lawyers I talk to have never heard of it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Well, and I had had a suspicion that this was going to happen, right? I don't think it's that surprising, particularly with an administration change. But the breaking news here for anybody who's joining us right now is that the NFIB, what is the NFIB, Kevin?
It's the
National Federation of Independent Business.
yes, that's right. Yeah, it's a small business. I hesitate to say like lobbying firm, but they represent the interests of small businesses. They partnered with the CIB or something like that as well. They filed this lawsuit, I think in March, which is pretty. I mean, I'm no litigator, but feels like a pretty long time. But given the kind of breadth of the issue, I guess it makes sense to get a permanent injunction of this type put in place. But yeah, they I mean, if you read their news release, I mean it's funny because it's written, I mean, directly to our audience and clientele, right? Talking about Main Street businesses and how onerous and kind of unreasonable the requirements are. The injunction was issued. I mean, I'm reading quickly, but on both First and Fourth Amendment grounds. It's both compelled speech as well as an invasion of privacy is kind of what the court held in issuing the injunction. So I don't know. It'll be fascinating to see where this goes. A permanent injunction's pretty. I mean, that's a long road of litigation to undo that, or more likely than that. This either goes away under a new administration in Congress or significantly changes or the scope, but it'll be interesting to watch what happens.
Well, Kevin, for those people that are tuning in right now that don't know what we're talking about, because again, the compliance rate on this was sub 10%. So I would guess that most people
Yeah,
don't know what the hell we're talking about.
90% of people tuning in are like, what is this screenshot Kevin posted?
Yeah, so let's start off just by setting the stage as to what the rule is. I've got a brief synopsis here, but effectively, as of January 1, 2024, so the beginning of this year, the U.S. Department of Treasury Financial Crimes Enforcement Network began requiring that companies report information as to who their beneficial owners are. The individuals actually own LLCs previously and different corporate entities. Previously, you'd form an entity, you'd have no idea. I have, well, let's not talk about what I have, but people people own things, and seeing through those, the ownership of those entities had always been not transparent, and they were
Yeah.
trying to obviously do away with that. And the reporting was for all corporations, LLCs, and other similar entities created and registered to do business in the U.S. However, 23 specific exemptions, including banking. And I think the biggest, most prominent exemption was if you have less than, and I don't have it in front of me here, but a certain amount of revenue in the business. So a lot of truly small businesses that are passive that haven't been utilized for operating were not implicated. I would give the specifics of that. We could get into the exact exemptions, but I don't think it matters at this point, because the upshot of this is that as of today, the Eastern District of Texas has struck it down. So, like I was telling Kevin when we first logged in, I have many clients. I suspect you do too. A few specific examples of a few guys that are in private equity that have a bunch of entities in their kind of personal and business holding codes that they were making these filings for, that now, at least at what we can surmise from the last few minutes, they can discontinue those efforts.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it appears to be. Fascinating. Not what I expected to see today, but
Uh-huh.
the Eastern District of Texas is you see a lot of big cases coming out of that court because it's known business friendly is probably the wrong term, but it's definitely for kind of some of this has changed over the years, but certainly patents, it used to be the place to go to, pretty sophisticated court and understanding kind of complex business issues and things like that. So it's no surprise that these nonprofit organizations strategically chose a Texas company, situated within the Eastern District for the case. And I guess I shouldn't be too surprised. But a permanent injunction of a bill like this is a pretty sweeping and pretty significant thing to do for a court. So that, I mean, they had to be pretty persuaded by the arguments, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to get more specific on what the arguments actually were. And what I was saying at the beginning of the hour, or the beginning of the live stream here, is that a number of prominent people had concerns about this. The most prominent that I was aware of is Janet Yellen. Actually wrote a letter a little bit less than a month ago to Congress. And the letter effectively said that, hey, the penalties for not making these filings by the end of the year, really significant. $590 per day, as well as felony charges and up to 2 years in prison. So if you owned a business entity, guys, gals listening to this, and that business entity did not make this filing by the end of the year, I bet a lot of people listening to this right now are going, holy shit, I was potentially subject to $590 in penalties per day and up to 2 years in prison. That's going to be news to a lot of people, because what she said in this letter from November 5th is less than 10% of the required submissions through November had been made. So I think it's obvious that at some point common sense had to prevail, and folks in power here had to say, and obviously ultimately as a judge, it's a shame that it always has to be a judge that strikes this down, and that
Yeah.
legislature and the administrative agencies that put these rules in place can't
Not the
just
ones
come,
in charge actually
yeah,
exercising some common sense.
get your shit together and go. 90% of people haven't made these filings. We're 90% of the way through the year, and the penalties are potentially up to 2 years in prison. Let's do something rational. But they didn't
Yeah,
do
it's
that.
crazy.
Obviously, it had to go to a judge. Um, Lawsuit argues that it was unconstitutional, exceeded Congress's authority over the states, improperly compelled speech, and contradicted the right of anonymous association. So I guess where it's at right now is there's an injunction. So they didn't really rule on the merits necessarily. They
That's right.
just said that the potential harm was so severe that they had to stop it in its tracks.
Yeah, and
Interesting.
I'm racking my brain. I don't remember law school well enough to understand. But I mean the hurdle for a permanent injunction though is pretty high. I mean, it's not like a more likely than not or something. I mean, it's a pretty high burden that the moving party would have to persuade the court that they're likely to succeed on the merits of the case. So, yeah, while it is an injunction, a permanent injunction like this, from my fuzzy recollection a few years ago in law school, is that this would kind of spell the death nail of the law as written in my mind, unless the government was, federal government was just able to come back with a really strong counter argument to persuade the court to reverse the injunction.
Yeah. So
But
this
who
is good.
knows?
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on it. I always get nervous in situations like this where it's almost like I had a flight and then Southwest Airlines texted me to say, your flight is delayed. It was an early morning flight. It was supposed to
Yeah.
take off at like 6 a.m. And they were like, your flight is delayed till 7:30. And I was like, yes, I'm going to sleep for another hour. And then so I go back to sleep and I wake up and they go, no, no, no. Actually, we changed our mind. We're going to leave on time. And they moved it back to 6 a.m. And so then I'm racing through the airport
This
while I'm trying to put my shirt on, going through TSA.
this literally
So
just happened Sunday night, taking my son to the airport to go back to college. They delayed his flight by an hour and a half. And of course, we live like 10 minutes from the airport. So I'm like, sweet, well, we'll hang out here. We'll leave in an hour, whatever. And all of a sudden he gets a text message moving it back an hour. So it was only a 30-minute delay. It was like, holy shit. And
there should be
I,
some rules against, we want to put some rules in place, Congress. Let's talk about that
seriously,
one because
seriously, let's
that's dumb.
legislate this shit. FinCEN, where are we at?
Yeah, right. Let's conquer something that's worth conquering, not making sure you know who is on the backside of LLCs. I don't know. Is there any good argument in your mind, Kevin? I mean, other than obviously what they were gunning for, which is to avoid, offshoring money and things like that. But setting that aside, is there a good reason why you need to know who owns an LLC or a corporation or any business entity?
Well, I mean, it always depends on who's asking the question, right? I mean, litigation, this comes up all the time. Like, who are you supposed to serve when you're serving a company? Uh, if you'd like to name owners individually, you can serve the company at their registered agent. But if you can't figure out who the owners are, you can't make like a direct negligence claim against an owner or something like that. So if you're a plaintiff wanting to file a civil suit, yeah, there's excellent reasons to want this information. Now, that I'm speaking broadly, this FinCEN information would not have been publicly available. These weren't, as I recall, they weren't subject to FOIA requests. There's no public accessibility to this database. It was supposed to just be restricted to financial crimes enforcement by federal law enforcement. But there are reasons and motivations that you may want this, and it's worth pointing out that the U.S. is definitely an outlier. Anyone who's done business or practiced corporate law abroad would know pretty much every country has a beneficial ownership reporting regime. So we've kind of been resting on the laurels of some of the things you cited in reading that press release that we approach things differently than a lot of countries with under the Constitution with the First Amendment, our right to anonymously assemble, which has been held by the Supreme Court to be implicit within the freedom to assemble. Our rights against compelled speech by the government, which is implicit in the freedom to engage in speech, the right to privacy, all those things that do kind of set our legal system apart from many other countries. I think provide a valid basis to be different, but it's not without precedent. We are for sure an outlier in this, from this perspective.
Is it because we're the best
I I
land
mean
of the free?
that's right, Merca baby.
Because I didn't hear anything you said, Kevin. I'll be honest. I was editing the
I could
subject line
tell.
on
I
Twitter.
could tell. In fact, I think the two people, my mom and your mom, that are tuned in on X right now, could tell that you aren't listening to a word I said.
Dude, we got 600 people watching this right now, my man.
I don't
So,
believe it.
Well, that's according to Elon Musk, and that man wasn't he famous for never telling a lie?
That man would never tell a lie, for sure.
It was I posted this thing because I went to this leadership retreat and we had a incredible dude speak to us from the organization that you and I now partner with called Uncommon Elite that places special forces operators. Quick plug for Uncommon Elite. Christian Ruff, who many people know is incredible. Christian was a member of the 160th Night Stalkers, incredible, best helicopter pilots in the world, and they are the guys that fly around the Navy SEALs, the Delta Force, and whoever else. And Christian's now running an incredible organization called Uncommon Elite that does performance coaching, but also placement of special forces
Hmm.
operators into small businesses. And we were at a leadership retreat speaking to one of the guys from Delta Force, was talking to us about leadership and how they think about leading. And these are, elite special forces.
Yeah.
And he went through the question he asked us was name four people, leaders that kind of exemplify, the very best leadership characteristics. And oddly enough, there was like 14 of us, like 12 of 14 people wrote down Elon Musk. And there was almost no other repeat names, which obviously recency bias, lots of things. And then, questions about character and all that. We'll sit out that debate, but suffice it to say 12 of 14 people wrote down Elon Musk's name. And there was almost no other repeats. Like George Washington was in there and like Nick Saban and some other people. And I
No, no
tweeted
Jim
this.
Harbaugh. I'm just asking for a friend.
No, there was no Harbaugh, although I do love Harbaugh. In like a weird way. You ever seen Harbaugh talk to Jameis Winston?
I have not.
Google Harbaugh did like a ESPN promo thing with Jameis Winston. It's super funny. And he's asking Jameis Winston about his disciplinary record from high school. And it's like laugh out loud funny watching Jim Harbaugh try to talk to Jameis Winston, two of the funniest people.
All right, I'll check it
Um,
out.
but anyways, long story short, I tweeted that out because I thought it was interesting. Cares about the rest of the exercise. But, obviously Delta Force, person talking about leadership was fascinating, but that was an interesting takeaway. But people got
Yeah.
really mad about that. There was a lot of people in the comments that were super mad and
I
basically
mean,
attacking our character.
I think it's interesting. It's an interesting spark to a debate about what is good leadership. I mean, obviously the outputs speak for themselves, but I do think that it, could give rise to a healthy debate of like, well, what does it mean to be a good leader? Because you know, from the little I know about how he operates his companies, I could certainly see people taking issue with. You could look at him as a success, but as a good leader, you know, I, he falls short in a lot of areas. Conversely, you could have people say, yeah, but look, the outputs speak for themselves. How do you do what he's done without being a good leader? I don't know. Not a debate I'm probably well versed to weigh in on, but I could see how it would generate very strong opinions.
Yeah, people were pretty ticked off about it. Um,
Yeah.
but I didn't make too much of it. All right.
Yeah,
So just to,
someone just retweeted my tweet saying this pertinent to anyone with a registered business, blah, 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 blah. Looks like we may not have to file after all. I just found out about this filing requirement not too
yeah,
long ago, so it may
yeah.
be of use to some. Just to reinforce what you've said a couple of times, there's just been such poor compliance because there's been such poor communication on what this law is, what it means, and certainly the draconian, you know, um, uh, things that liabilities that will happen for failure to comply. I can't think today, but
Well,
anyway.
and Kevin, I actually didn't make any of the filings myself. Did you actually make any of the filings?
Yeah, I've done a number. I very very early on, like first thing this year, I did one of my personal entities and pulled a personal FinCEN ID for my investment entity just so I could understand the process. And then I've done a few others. It's not complicated, but it is a little bit technical, right? Like there are issues of what what or who is a beneficial owner that has to be reported. There is a requirement in the filing that you have to include the FinCEN ID or identification of the person who actually submits the filing. Well, we as a law firm, we do all of our submissions through a third party service. And so you have to go to that third party service and find the random employee in Timbuktu, Minnesota. Shout out to our partner, Jake, that actually submitted the filing and get a copy of their passport and birth date to make this filing. Like, it's just like some of this stuff is just so crazy and hyper technical. But then you get into matters of interpretation. There's an argument to be made that you don't actually have to do that if there's a different person that directed the filing. So maybe it's me as the lawyer that instructed the company to make the filing that you would have to report for some third parties FinCEN requirement. So it's not like a terribly long. It take it like, especially knowing how to do it now, it'd take me 3 or 4 minutes to do a filing for someone, but it is technical. And so you're not only is there criminal and financial penalties for non-compliance for anyone that isn't really a lawyer or well versed in this stuff. There's also just the expense aspect of you kind of have to pay someone to do the filing for you so you don't risk screwing something up and imposing civil and criminal liabilities on yourself. And it's like, I've seen people, charging quite a bit of money for these filings that aren't super complicated, but they take time. They're a nuisance, and people have a right to be compensated for their work. So it's just the whole regime, the whole concept of it, all around is just so, it's been so bizarre, for what, you know I'm sure someone in the federal government thought was a fairly innocuous ask. Like, yeah, we should just
Yeah,
ask
it
people to
was,
self-report
but
who
it,
their
you,
owners
you
are.
know, flashback to Obamacare, and I'm not talking about the merits of Obamacare, but the rollout of it, right? And the botching of, the government simply trying to set up a website, right? And how disastrous that was.
Hmm.
And I bet there's a lot to be said about that. That's probably more myth than reality. But point being is the requirement isn't so bad. And what I was getting at with my question is, have you actually made these filings? Because I haven't, but I've watched them be
Yeah.
made by our paralegals and associates. Is that they're really not that complicated to make, right? The actual nuts and bolts, it takes
No.
10 minutes to do once you're
Anyone
doing
who's
it
comfortable with the rules could go make their own
in 10
filing in
minutes.
in less than 10 minutes. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not hard.
Well, 10 minutes for me because it's 8 minutes to turn my laptop on and then you got to call
That's right.
you and
Three
say, hey,
minutes. 3 minutes for
not
anyone
working
else.
for
That's
me,
right.
but 3 minutes for anybody else. But less than 10% compliance, 90 plus
That's
percent
crazy.
of people that were supposed to make this filing that had from January to, and I bet there would be a crazy push in November and December of people that
Yeah.
know they have to do it, but just have not yet. So I suspect there's some of that. The
I,
folks that are,
I'd be I'd be curious, and in fact, if anyone's actually listening, sound off in the comments if you know of something. I would be curious. I'm like racking my brain. When's the last time a blanket law that applies to, I mean, I don't know how much of our population this applies to, but it's got to be an astronomical number, um, in terms of the amount of people who have beneficial ownership in some form of business, above the threshold. When is the last time that a new law had never been on the books that compels millions of people to actively do something under the threat of criminal liability? Like what's an analog for this? Like I'd be
um,
curious to kind of compel. So like how does this rollout compare? Like what's the last time we've just made up a new law that says, hey, everyone, you've got to go make some filing, do something that you didn't never had to do before. And if you don't, we're going to put you in jail for up to 2 years and fine
well,
you.
Obamacare had the compliance requirement, but it wasn't under threat of imprisonment. You'd pay an additional tax if you
Yeah,
didn't
that's right.
buy insurance and the individual mandate. They would tax you or
Right.
penalize you.
Right.
But actually, criminal. What are the laws that we're forced to comply with? Reporting requirement laws that we're forced to comply. I mean, the IRS code. Obviously, if you don't comply with those requirements, you go to prison.
Yeah.
Um, but otherwise,
Even then,
a
not
great
usually
question.
though. I mean, people like don't take this as tax advice for everyone listening, but
Yeah,
generally people only go to jail for failure to comply with the tax code if the IRS proves it's purposeful. Like if you mess something up because you got something wrong, you're going to get a fine, you're going to get a penalty, but they're generally not putting you in jail. They're putting the people who have been skirting taxes on purpose and Wesley, shout out to my boy Wesley Snipes, right?
Snipes. Yeah,
Who are actively like committing tax fraud and tax evasion. It feels so draconian, and maybe like when push came to shove, they weren't actually going to be putting people in prison for this. It seems so far fetched to imagine that they would have.
yep,
And
yep.
so maybe that 2 years was just the hammer, the threat for people that like systematically and purposely were, not complying. But anyway, it just
Yeah, and we just went over 1,000 viewers, so let's just summarize for folks that are listening in right now or watching. Um, as of the beginning of this year, the U.S. Department of Treasury Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, put in place through the Corporate Transparency Act, the CTA, a requirement that companies report their beneficial ownership. So corporations, LLCs, any business entity. Previously, it was a mystery who owned those. They said, nope, you need to now go out and actually affirmatively report that. Now, somebody asked a question in the comments. They said, what is a good explanation for why they would want that? Kevin, you gave a really spirited answer that concluded with, basically America being the greatest country on earth, if I heard you correctly a few minutes ago. But the upshot
right
being
channeling
transparency.
my Aaron Sorkin in the newsroom. But
Yeah, yeah, but and you can repeat that in just a second. But the requirement basically asked us business owners, people who own business entities, to go onto the FinCEN website and make a very short form disclosure of who's involved. And there are some technical complexities to it, as Kevin mentioned previously, um, but not hard in execution. And there were a number or there are a number of exemptions to it, exceptions to it for things like SEC reporting companies. Obviously, if you're a publicly traded company, you already have sufficient reporting requirements. No need there.
yeah,
Banks, credit unions, bank holding companies, money service business, broker dealers, 40 Act.
basically this whole list are companies that are already reporting their beneficial ownership in some other fashion to the federal government.
With one exception, well, not one exception, but one prominent exception, which is large operating companies, entities with more than 20 full-time U.S. employees, an operating presence at a physical office within the U.S., and over 5 million in gross receipts and sales. So that's a pretty big exception. So basically, this is like, hey, if you own a small business, um, or a small business entity, and you're using it to try to whatever, we're going to figure it out. This is what they
Yeah,
were gunning for.
yeah,
And obviously, the reason we're live right now is that as of today, a case called Texas Top Cop Shop Inc. et al. Versus Garland, in the U.S. Eastern District of Texas, a court granted a preliminary injunction blocking the reporting requirements. And I think that the biggest reason for that, not having, not being in the mind of the judge, there are a number of concerns around constitutional requirements and the like. But I think the biggest thing is that we are through November. And a letter that I read a few minutes ago that was written by Janet Yellen to Congress last month on November 5th, her argument was we need to slow down because we are through November. 100% of the businesses that need to, well, only 10% of the businesses that need to actually make these filings have made these filings, and the penalties are really severe. $500 plus per day with a maximum penalty, felony charges of up to potentially 2 years in prison if you don't report the ownership. So ultimately, it's December 3rd. I can't imagine that 10% number has increased in a material way. So
yeah.
something had to give. And as always, you leave it to a unelected judge in somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Texas. Where is the Eastern District of Texas? Is that
It
Dallas?
covers part. I mean, it goes all the way out east, but it covers part of Dallas.
Part of Dallas. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, interestingly, well, no, I'm not going to digress, but yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep. So
yeah. I mean, to circle back to the question, I mean, the direct purported, you know, purpose behind this requirement. It's to circle back. This is a FinCEN beneficial ownership requirement. FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It's an arm of the Department of Justice, and so the stated purpose and the idea behind this data is it wasn't going to be publicly available. It wasn't going to be shared broadly. I mean, I feel free to sound off in the comments your conspiracy theories of what like that none of that's true, but like whatever. The stated purpose, this information only goes to FinCEN and it's only used for really one reason and one reason only, and that is to track ownership of otherwise non-transparent entities for purposes of enforcing financial crimes. So if the federal government is trying to take down a drug smuggling ring, for example, and are trying to track finances in a money laundering, a complex web of entities involved in a money laundering scheme to help launder money for a drug, some drug ring or whatever, that's what this data would be used for, would previously, without subpoenaing private records and trying to get compliance with private subpoenas and things like that, it's very difficult to find out who owns a private, small, solo LLC. There's no reason that anyone would know that, whatever entity that I own was actually owned by me. There's no record of it. There's no official record of that anywhere unless they came and subpoenaed my files off of my computer to see that. So that was the stated purpose, was that this would give the information needed to the Department of Justice to kind of confirm who is involved in the ownership and operation of otherwise opaque businesses, in the event that that information was needed to enforce financial crimes. So, I mean, do with that what you will, but that's kind of been the purpose and stated reason here.
Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine if we took a survey of our audience, which is primarily entrepreneurs and people who own these businesses that are going to fit within this
Yeah,
non-exempt criteria, um, you know, the less hassle, the better.
totally.
Um, I certainly appreciate what you're communicating around having some transparency for financial crime related reasons, and that's a good thing. But
Well, yeah, and again, that's always the tension in all these things is it's, again, put aside whether you think it'll be used by the government for nefarious reasons or not. The stated outward purpose is a good one, right? As with a lot of these laws that are struck down, they're not done necessarily for nefarious means. I know some of you will probably label me a woke liberal for making that claim because you think the federal government only has nefarious aims. But I mean, I think the spirit of that is correct. That the idea here was a good one. We should be prosecuting financial crimes, etc. But at what expense always becomes the tension with our Constitution of what can you compel private citizens to do to comply with. How necessary is it? How invasive is it? And I think
well,
that's where a lot of the tension and pushback comes from.
that's where I'll push back on you, right? Because I don't agree that it's necessarily a good thing to make us all universally do it, right? You're telling me that if there is an entity or a business or whomever that is engaged in criminal activities, that the IRS or the FBI or whomever can't pierce through that and figure out who owns it. I don't believe that's true. I
Well,
really
they
don't believe
can.
that's
It's
true.
just this would make it a lot easier.
This would make it easy, right? But in the process of making us all report universally,
I
and
don't know
the
if you
privilege of
I don't know if you misheard me that I was saying that everyone should be compelled to do this. I wholeheartedly agree with
I
you.
stopped listening after you said
I can
that
tell.
after you conceded you were a woke liberal. I stopped listening to you. Uh, well, because I think, obviously, if you can do business in the US without, forming an entity, right? You can
Yep.
go out, I can go out and I can practice law not through an entity in my own individual name, right? But then I have potentially unlimited liability for it. I
Yep.
don't get the benefit of the legal limited liability that comes with forming an entity. So now, every single time I form an entity, I got to go to the government and tell the government that I own that entity. It doesn't sound that crazy on paper, but what does sound crazy to me on paper is making every single business entity in America go back to the government now and
Yeah,
and complete this information. If they had said, going forward, moving forward for all newly formed entities, that part of the process would be that the states are required from an administrative perspective to report that information. I mean, obviously, there's lots of federalism arguments and things like that there, but I care less about that, and I care a hell of a lot more about the administrative burden and the
100%.
headache because the last thing that any business owner needs in December is to have to think about making one more filing. And the lobbies and everybody, I get these emails from LegalZoom. They're going to do it for me for $500 or whatever. What a joke! It's a
Yeah.
very simple filing to make. Um, so a lot of people obviously trying to take advantage of the situation. So I don't know.
Which is a lot of what our regulatory state offers, right? I mean, some would argue that our profession, the existence of our profession, to a large extent, and they may not be wrong. I'd probably agree more than disagree with that statement. So,
All right. I think we've made the point clear. We'll post the article. We'll post information on it. And obviously, guys, the disclaimer here is everything in this video, everything in this live stream is for educational and informational purposes only. Please consult your own advisors, tax advisors, legal advisors, a shaman, whoever you need to talk to that's not Kevin and I to get guidance here. Because the reality is what was issued today is a preliminary injunction by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Texas. It could be reversed tomorrow. So continue to stay tuned. Don't just think that this means that you can just forget that this requirement exists. It's quite conceivable too that they come back and uphold the law and just say, hey, we're going to stay it for an additional year. So it's going to be implemented in December of 2025, which is what Janet Yellen was pushing for in her letter last month anyways. So stay
yeah,
tuned for more on this. Don't, write it off now.
love it.
All right, cool. Thanks, Kev.